Welcome to Byju's classes. We are back again with another edition of our weekly review of international affairs and the background which should be very useful for you in your preparations for competitive examinations. We want to begin our discussion this week with a close look at China. The whole of the year 2020, the world focused on China because that is where the COVID-19 virus had escaped, either was allowed to escape deliberately or it escaped accidentally and created havoc all over the world. And it is not surprising that when the new year began and the new decade began, the world would still be looking very apprehensively, expectantly at China. Variety of reasons for this. Because just before the year ended, China succeeded in signing a very interesting and intriguing agreement with the European Union, where European Union wanted to put pressure on China about human rights violations and suppression of democratic movement in Hong Kong, Muslims in Uyghur Xinjiang province. And the Chinese were very keen that no reference should be made to that, but they would insist that the French and the Germans at least put pressure on the rest of the European Union to sign an agreement which would not dislocate China's trade, export, etc. very much, and China would leverage its advances in telecom technology to get this. Now this was interesting because China was signaling to America that it had enough aces up its sleeve to persuade the European Union to follow at least path different from what Trump was trying to impose on them, and the trade war on China should be probably relegated to margins. At the same time, President Biden had taken over and the world was expecting that how he would respond to China. Biden made it very clear that he would treat People's Republic of China as competitor number one for challenge number one for the United States of America, but also made it clear while he would stand up to Chinese expansions rather sternly, he would be very willing to renegotiate this whole relationship and perhaps emphasize more on cooperation than on conflict. There was another reason that the world was looking at China at this time, because the Chinese had seemed to control the coronavirus after the original crisis in the Wuhan province by strict lockdowns, and people of course did not quite believe what was coming out of China. They thought that the Chinese were being economical with truth. The data from China could not be believed very easily. But the Chinese did open up their economies and started the process of recovery rather fast. While the rest of the world was reeling under the ravaged economic systems, China would claim that they had started operating their industrial units, and the Chinese also said there are certain Chinese companies which were making interesting profits. Not only surprisingly, the Chinese company, the American companies located in China were also making profits like Apple of about $100 billion in a month. So there was something which the Chinese were doing right. But in the month of January, there were problems and hiccups again. The WHO team started its investigation of how the virus had escaped in Wuhan. Now, had the Chinese taken enough precautions, had they warned the world about the pandemic in time, they had not exerted illegitimate pressure on WHO, which delayed in declaring the pandemic into a pandemic, all these things were there, and a little drama was involved. Where when the WHO team reached there, an unexpected second wave surged of coronavirus infections in China, this time in Hebei province, next door to Beijing, and the Chinese were forced to ask the WHO team members to delay their inspection to begin with, and then restrain 2 members of the WHO team in Singapore for quarantine reasons. But ultimately this began. Obviously the WHO team knows it will take some time, but the Chinese made certain announcements which surprised the world. While the whole world, the major economies were shrinking, the Chinese claimed that their economic growth rate was positive. It was small compared to China's fantastic growth rate in the past few decades, but 3.2 or 3.5% was impressive enough for 2 quarters running for China. Before we take up these issues, there were certain other things which were concerning about China in the new year, in the month of January. China seemed to have overcome the impact of disruption of its supply chains, disruption of its economic relationship with the ASEAN countries, with the Australian continent, and also in other countries in Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa, where it is a remarkable footprint. Partly this was done by the Chinese vaccine diplomacy. The Chinese vaccine may have had an efficacy slightly lower than what the Western pharma companies were claiming, but the Chinese vaccine had no such problems about refrigeration at very low temperatures and transportation and logistics. And China was very generous by inoculating not only its own population, but also making it available to countries like Philippines, to Nepal, to Sri Lanka, to countries in Africa, as far away as in Latin America. Even this vaccine diplomacy made people rethink about China, that how successful had Chinese been, not only in 2020, not only towards the end of the year, when its economy was making positive strides, that China had infiltrated the economies of Western nations to an extent where they could not do without it. As the world was groping with the second wave of the coronavirus surge, they were groping with mutants in UK, in Brazil, and France surfacing, and South Africa. They also were being made conscious that how much they depended on Chinese, not only for low-cost equipment, consumer durables, or telecom, strategically important telecom technology. It was in trying to cope with the pandemic, even low-cost things like surgical gloves, masks were being imported from China, and also the things which went into advanced pharmaceuticals, intermediates, they were coming out from China. So the dependence on China for the rest of the world to recover their economies was made very, very transparent. Now, how has China done this? This requires a little historical retrospective and to get the correct background and perspective. It was way back in towards the last years of the decade of 80s and the early 1990s that Deng Xiaoping started the era of four great modernizations in China, started the policy of economic liberalization. It began with small beginnings. The small village Shenzhen near Hong Kong was declared in Special Economic Zone, SEZ, where the foreign investors and industrialists would get very favorable terms. They would get tax rebates, they would be assured of a large skilled manpower to work in their factories, and also they were all tempted by the vast Chinese market, which seemed very, very promising to them. The Chinese were very keen. They also assured them investment-friendly reforms. There would be not too much restrictions put on their growth about environmental restrictions. So China would isolate the two parts of the country. Majority of China would remain outside the SEZ, but the regime which worked politically, labor laws, environmental restrictions would be different in SEZ. The whole world seemed to benefit from this. Obviously, things changed as time passed. The world was first hoping that these economic reforms would pave the way for political reform, and China would, after adopting a modified version of capitalist mode of production, would also opt for the Western-style democratic processes, which never happened. Deng Xiaoping made it very clear when he crushed all opposition and dissents at the Tiananmen Square brutally that the two things were separate. While China would, to catch up with the West, adopt certain modified forms of capitalism. Deng is famous to have said, how does the color of the cat matter as long as it catches mice? But politics would be a different state. And also the state-controlled capitalist model which China implemented in the country was slightly different. It was state capitalism. China would allow private capitalists to compete as much with Western companies on their terms, on the terms of market demand, state-of-the-art technology, cutting costs and so on. But there was a control. They remained under watch, and many of these companies had close ties with the Chinese state. Either they had ties with the army or they had ties with the intelligence apparatus in China. This is what has made the world very, very apprehensive and suspicious about Huawei and things of that kind. But take the instance, towards the end of the year, there was a great mystery about the fate of the Chinese multi-billionaire Jack Ma, who had started the Alibaba company and had a very interesting presence on the internet and was dealing with almost all countries of the world. But the Chinese are very sensitive to this, that when a high-flying individual seems to challenge the Chinese state or the government or the party, they are immediately cut down to size, and many of them have had to incur the wrath of the party to undergo a long-term jail term, and they are told that there are limits to their independence even in the economic sphere. Now, this model is interesting that all the credit seems to be at the moment being taken by Xi Jinping. But if you recall the history of recent China, we would be very naive not to believe that this is all one man's accomplishment. After Deng Xiaoping, there were his successors, Hu Jintao, before him Jiang Zemin, who ruled over the destinies of China for a period of about 10 years each. They were also powerful leaders, but none of them had concentrated power in their hands like Xi Jinping has done. Now, Xi Jinping is an extremely interesting character. By now, he is being canonized, deified, worshipped, idolized, almost put at par as Mao Zedong. He is the president, he is the head of the party, he is the head of the military commission. So all three sources, important levers of power in China, are controlled by him. More interestingly, in the past year, what he had done was to put his imprint on the Chinese constitution, which allows him to almost supreme ruler of China as long as he wants. So the point is that no opponent has been allowed to emerge even second rank, third rank. And of course, there is a myth making about Xi Jinping. But this is not to say that Xi Jinping is only a creature of propaganda machine of the party in the China at the moment. Xi Jinping has also been far more adventurous and dynamic than his predecessors, partly because of the reason the world environment has changed. The political power and ambition of the United States of America, for a variety of reasons, has shrunk. There was reckless diplomacy, there was unpredictable diplomatic behavior by Trump, but also the world was moving away from interdependence of WTO, because when Trump declared America first, when oil politics was in a tumble, the Chinese realized that this was a time to come out. And Deng has also given another dictum: lie low when you are weak, but enter the center stage dramatically, show your power when you are strong enough. So by the time, for a variety of reasons, when Xi Jinping last year mounted this thing, actually, it had started a year before, but last year the coronavirus gave him an opportunity to exercise the soft power of China as well as the hard power of China. The hard power of China continued, that although the military confrontation with India had taken place sometime in June in the icy desert of Ladakh, but despite 9-10 rounds of talk, China was not yielding any ground, and so there would be talk, but China would insist that these talks would be separate and a parallel track of economic negotiations, trade negotiations should continue. The Indian government, realizing its dependence on the Chinese economic interaction, the trade, which was close to $90 billion before the conflict broke out, would not name China openly as an enemy, but keep talking of meeting the threat at its border, and invested a lot of money and deployed a lot of armed forces on this frontier. Now, China was also expanding in South China Sea, but when China seemed to be opening too many fronts at the same time, it would shift attention from either Himalayan conflict to South China Sea, or from South China Sea to the Latin American footprint where it was extending. But I think what should be accepted is that Xi Jinping started with a very ambitious scheme as soon as he appeared of the One Road, One Belt initiative. It was the reconstruction of the old Silk Route on the land in this Central Asia, through Far East to Turkey, and he imagined new routes to Africa and extended up to Europe and extended it up to Latin America, and also doing the maritime spice route, which originally the Indians thought that was they were the pioneers there, but Chinese would claim that the Admiral Jing Ho, medieval times, had extended the footprint, and historically the China's claim on all of South China Sea was there. The Chinese fishing trawlers were there. So what China has been doing in the past year, and mostly towards the end of the year and the beginning of January, is to keep shifting focus, keep building pressure at one place, then shift it to other place. When there is a pushback, it would say that Taiwan should not try to assert its independence, otherwise China doesn't rule out a military action to reunify it. It would put pressure, psychological warfare on Japan or South Korea to say that as long as they don't misbehave, China would probably tolerate. But if they asserted their geopolitical arena, sphere of influence in this region, there would be inevitable conflict. And they were trying to think of this, that after Trump goes away, the kind of support which Trump gave to Taiwan or to Japan would not be there. They also thought that after Shinzo Abe had vacated the stage for his successor did not have either the charisma or the gumption to take on the Chinese. Now, this is interesting because in Taiwan, before the present president was elected, the earlier regime had a very cozy relationship with the Chinese. But this regime asserts its independence and has a problem. Now, the interesting part is this, that Biden, after assuming presidency, has made it very clear last month he believes in one China policy, which implies that Taiwan cannot expect that kind of unflinching support from America as Trump was asserting at one stage. But interestingly, although America doesn't have a normal diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, they also have a trade representation office and so on. But the point is that the American economy also has very close ties for supply chain, for its telecom equipment, for other computers, etc. The largest chip making facilities are in Taiwan. In South Korea has a great facility for making LCD screens and so on. So the problem is that while it is a very interesting tightrope balancing act, which America and the West have to do, they cannot afford to displease China. At the same time, they cannot afford to be yielding the right of way to China everywhere, whether it is economics, technology, or in Southeast Asia or in Far East. So we have this extremely interesting relationship. Now, to go back for a moment to the vaccine diplomacy and the One Belt, One Road initiative. Now, the One Belt, One Road initiative, which began originally as originating from China and covering the nations in Central Asia, the traditional Silk Route, now has more than 100 nations, including nations in Africa, South Asia, and in Latin America, some in Europe as well, in this network. In this network, many scholars believe that the Chinese had been trying for years, past at least 3-4 years, to ensnare these countries in a debt trap. Chinese leader Xi Jinping would make promises of billions of dollars of assistance for infrastructure development, for bailing out people from their earlier debts, like in case of Pakistan, $3 billion to repay the Saudis, or $1 billion for a port development to Sri Lanka. And these things would make these countries beholden to China, and especially when the richer countries in the West, in the coronavirus thing, cornered almost 3/4 of the total production of the vaccines, and they could afford to pay a higher price, and they tried to have vaccine nationalism, like the European Union would say that it would not allow AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, to get out of the European facilities, export to post-Brexit, unless the European countries' requirements were met. So similarly, the Americans would say we will buy out as the first charge all the Pfizer vaccine, all the Moderna vaccine, and the other vaccines, Johnson & Johnson's coming out. So the interesting part is the Chinese at this stage made available at a concessional rate, almost at a subsidized rate, its vaccines to these countries. So they don't have too much choice. They in any case owe China too much money, and they have either leased out territory to China, or they are not in a position to repay the loan. Which can they do? So China has this extremely interesting soft power diplomacy via vaccine, via infrastructural development, which it has been leveraging. So this, as long as we keep in mind, we have to worry very much about what China has been doing in the neighborhood. China, of course, we refer to Pakistan, we refer to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, we refer to Chinese support to Pakistan whenever it is entrapped as a host state of international terrorism. And the Chinese have been able to sort of work out their strategy of encircling India through either Nepal or through Sri Lanka. We shall come to that separately when we discuss South Asia, but right now we have a very interesting situation where Putin seems to have realized at the moment what its ambitions are, and as we have discussed in past, he is for the first time in his career confronted with a challenger who might not be able to unseat him, but who might become a symbol of opposition, a unifying rallying point, which might create problems for an aging Putin in coming years to come. He has succeeded in annexing Crimea. He has succeeded in mediating between Armenia, Azerbaijan. He has maintained a tightrope balancing act between Turkey and Iran. He has also managed to intervene and conflicts in Africa, from Libya to Central Africa to Northwestern Africa, but he is quite content to lie low for the moment and bide his time. So China is the only country which seems to be the major player in the coming months vis-a-vis the United States of America. And as we discussed in past, the Americans have a different set of priorities before they can assert themselves as a dynamic, decisive player in the international arena. China has no such compulsions. Its economy is doing well. It is an authoritarian regime where the public opinion doesn't seem to bother Xi Jinping very much. He doesn't seem to have a challenge anywhere else, and he can brush aside the criticism on the grounds of violation of human rights or suppression of democratic movement in Hong Kong. The whole world may cry itself hoarse that he has annexed in the past few months, broken the back of the democratic movement in Hong Kong, which has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. But the Chinese can say that they have not annexed or done anything. They have only taken back which had been annexed by Britain. They have taken back what belonged to them in past also. And if they assert that they are not interested in the Westminster, the Western style model of democracy, nobody can really blame them for this kind of an interpretation. What does China do? Why is China so keen to make good of this dramatic moment? The Chinese are approaching two landmarks very easily. 2021 is the centenary year of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. And very soon, China would be celebrating the 75th year of the success of its revolution. The Chinese have already under Xi Jinping declared that within a very short while, 2025, they would overtake the American economy. And they think that by 2035, they would have overtaken the American economy. While the American economy is shrinking, the Chinese economy is also shrinking. But a larger economy, when it suffers a shrinkage, is reduced in size much more. And the Chinese economy is number 2 economy at the moment. So it is also going to be an interesting case study to see that whether China, even with reduced growth, can manage to occupy the position which Russia once had. The number 2 power claiming parity with America, with very soon becoming a country which probably is number 1 at the pole position. The Chinese have been demonstrating their spectacular muscle in space explorations, in launching rockets, launching missiles, making aircraft carriers on their own, nuclear-powered subs, and this is something which the Americans are worried of, the Europeans are worried about, and of course, the countries on the periphery of China's border should be very concerned. It is understandable that the attention of the analysts of international relations and strategic experts has been focused on the 3 big powers, United States of America, Russia, and People's Republic of China, how they will behave in the new year and in the new decade. But as far as India is concerned, we are also a rising power. We also have a legitimate claim to be treated, if not as a big power, if not as a superpower, but very much a power which has interests of its own, which has capabilities of its own, and which can also be interested in projecting its power, hard and soft, in its immediate region and of course globally. It is not a minor regional power which can play a subordinate role or surrender its national interest if a superpower or a larger power does it. India has been having a confrontation with China more than 6 months with China after the Galwan clashes in the Ladakh Valley. But interestingly, what we must keep in mind is that the Indians, while they have pushed back China at Ladakh and acquitted themselves very well in the military confrontation, not much progress has been made in the round of negotiations. We reclaimed certain strategic heights in Pangong Lake area, but we have not been able to secure the pushback of China from the line of actual control, which they had trespassed. And the problem remains that China shifts its focus from Ladakh to Arunachal, sometime in between to Sri Lanka, trying to provoke Nepal into making claims on the Nepal-Tibet-India border. And India doesn't know how to cope with China either diplomatically, because we know that we can't trust or believe any diplomatic assurance given by China. Even if it is a written treaty, China can violate it any time, and there is nothing India would be able to do about it. The Chinese have succeeded in forcing India to deploy in heavy measure in Ladakh, imposing a great economic burden on China, and India has had to go buying for aircrafts like Rafale, missiles like SS-400, and we have to worry about the economic costs and the social costs of this continued confrontation, which seems to be going in for a long haul. China has been following a very diabolical policy of extending its footprint in areas where once India was influential, India was seen as a friend, was the largest donor, for instance, in Nepal. In December and January, the crisis in Nepal, the constitutional crisis, has been aggravating. Indians have played a very tactful, diplomatically correct role by saying that whatever is happening between Prachanda and Prime Minister Oli is an internal matter of Nepal. They should amicably settle it. But the fact is that the Chinese ambassador in Nepal has been very active, meeting the president, meeting the prime minister, meeting Prachanda, trying to unify the Communist Party of Nepal and trying to broker a deal all the time and increase Chinese influence. There has been some resistance by the pro-monarchist parties, there has been some resistance by the non-communist parties of Nepal. In Nepal also there has been some resentment that the Chinese have trespassed in its territory and established some villages and so on. Now it is difficult because like in India, like in Bhutan, like in Nepal, the situation is more like this. You have an undefined border, you have an extended no man's land, and you have the Himalayan wilderness, and the stronger military power can assert itself. Now the Nepalese, ever since the Communist Party was unified under the Chinese influence, have had to accede to the Chinese advice. This advice is basically a euphemism for following policies which are detrimental to the interests of India. Now what India can do about it is very little actually. So it can only wait and watch what China does in Nepal. Fortunately for India, the resentment of the common people in Nepal who have taken out positions against China. So, but of course, any communist leader can say this is being done at the behest of India, but Indians have played a correct diplomatic role vis-a-vis Nepal. But the situation in Nepal doesn't seem to be improving. The Prachand, who has greater influence in the Communist Party United of Nepal, has expelled Prime Minister Oli from that. They have taken a case to the Supreme Court that how could Prime Minister Oli, being in a minority, recommend a solution of the parliament, and they have implicated the president and Oli as those people who are wrecking Nepalese interests. Now, when Prachand was in power, he was also accused of being pro-India at one stage, but of course things change very fast in Nepal. So at the moment we watch with caution what is happening in Nepal. The situation should be decided slightly when the Supreme Court pronounces a decision or where the elections which have been scheduled as projected by Oli in March, April take place. But Nepal will take some time getting used to its Republican avatar and acquire some maturity in dealing with other political parties, other politicians, etc. What is causing more concern is something like Sri Lanka. In this month, the Indian Foreign Minister made a very high-profile visit to Sri Lanka, and the whole idea was that he was going to negotiate the deal of the eastern port of the Colombo port. Interestingly, this is a very interesting story. The India was first offered the partnership to reconstruct, improve, enlarge the western port at the investment of about $1 billion. Indians opted out of it. Now, unfortunately, $1 billion for such a strategic investment was not a very big sum. India has been investing billions of dollars in Afghanistan under American persuasion. Now, presently what is happening, right after Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Minister, returned from Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government declared that they were reneging on the agreement which they had signed with India and Japan as a guarantor. India had taken the precaution of partnering Japan, and Japan had offered many $billion loan at 1% interest rate, long-term repayable. It was almost a grant to the Sri Lankan government. So the Indians thought that the Japanese money and Indian technology would be tempting enough for Sri Lanka. Now, one reason is that the Indians have unfortunately always tied their relationship with Sri Lanka with the politics of Tamil Nadu. Even this time when Jaishankar went to Colombo, he made a point of saying that it is in the interest of all parties that the minorities' interests are looked after, which meant the Tamils in the Jaffna area and Tamils elsewhere in Sri Lanka. Now also the Indians identified a little more closely with the predecessor government of the Rajapakse when Rajapakse was out of power, and Rajapaksa had made a very atypical, undiplomatic statement at that stage that he had lost power due to machinations of the Indians who did not like him very much. So he comes to India as a pilgrim, he is given a red carpet treatment, but in the heart of heart he knows that the Indians value the interests of the Tamilians in Sri Lanka more than anything else. This time also, the Indian foreign minister went there and said there was a sudden rise in killings of Indian fishermen. And he said, we have taken this up again very strongly with the Sri Lankan government. Elections are due in very near future in Tamil Nadu. The central government cannot remain indifferent to that. But the problem remains that this gives the Chinese an opportunity to exclude India from any infrastructural development plans of any significance in Sri Lanka. As far as the Sri Lankan government is concerned, they said we can't do anything about it. The trade unions have protested against it. The people where this project is going to be implemented don't want it. We can't do that. But this is a very clever ploy of the Sri Lankan government. No trade union seems to be objecting about national honor, national pride, national ownership when the Hambantota port, where the Chinese are active, is there. So this is something which the government of India has to worry about what is happening. As if this was not bad enough, something which complicated India's diplomatic stance in South Asia was the military coup in Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi, who had put her neck out, stuck her neck out, gone and defended her government's, which is thinly disguised military rule in the International Court of Justice against the charges of genocide of the Rohingya Muslims. Now the Rohingya Muslims have been forced to get out of Burma, the Rakhine state, the stateless persons, to come as refugees to Bangladesh in millions. Some of them have come down to India, hundreds of thousands. And Bangladesh has very patiently borne the burden, having itself one time exported refugees to neighboring countries. But it just does not have the economic resources to treat these refugees in a manner where their human rights are not unwittingly violated. And the point is that the Chinese have come out with a very diplomatic statement about Myanmar. They have not criticized the military takeover of the government. Actually, it is not a military takeover, because even when Aung San Suu Kyi was the state councillor, supposedly the figurehead, ceremonial head of the state and decision maker, the army had 25% of the seats reserved for it, the Tatmadaw Do, which is the name of the army in the Myanmarese parliament, and they called the shots. So the problem is that Aung San Suu Kyi knew that she would survive in the power as long as the army cooperated. Army had never relinquished power. Now the Chinese would be very happy to deal with the army, because the army knows that it cannot survive if the Chinese go against them. But the Chinese have absolutely no interest, strategic or economic, to restore democracy in Myanmar. Let us not forget that ever since the original coup in 1962, which overthrew UNO, the Burmese army has called all the shots in Myanmar. Now, interestingly, Chinese have a very interesting relationship in its southern part and the Shan and Karen and Kachin states in Burma. Now, the Burmans may be a majority, but the tribes which do not belong to the Burman majority, the Karens, the Shans, the Kachins, the Mons, have been raising a revolt, armed insurgency all these years. And the government in Yangon had followed a policy of live and let live. Now, as far as India is concerned, India is worried about insurgency, residual insurgency, lawlessness, organized crime, smuggling of narcotics or arms from this anarchical part of Burma to the Indian border. The Manipur, the state, is next door, Nagaland is next door, and there have been cases of hot pursuit, and India needs to maintain realistic enough, cordial enough a relationship with Burma. But India also happens to be at the moment non-permanent member of the Security Council. So it has to come out as a member of the Security Council, a unanimous resolution which is more or less condemnatory of what has happened in Burma. But India has always followed the policy of realpolitik, not giving total support to Aung San Suu Kyi when she was earlier under house arrest, although she claimed to be a follower of Gandhian Satyagraha. So the Indians have had this problem, this diplomatic challenge in the weeks and months to come. How do we react to the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh and in Myanmar? With the coup, all hopes of Rohingyas returning even in distant future to their homeland are lost. India cannot afford to antagonize the army too much, but it cannot allow the Chinese to increase their influence in Myanmar. So this is something which we will really have to watch very, very cautiously. That is all we have for you this week. Next week, we shall have more of this information for you. We shall now shift our focus to other major powers. We'll go to the European Union. We shall see what is happening in the African continent. We will also have to focus on the changing geopolitical map in Middle East. And finally, we will have to go back to the Anglosphere, United Kingdom post-Brexit, countries like Australia, Canada, and what kind of a relationship they have with America. There is plenty more to follow in the weeks to come. Stay with us. We hope you find this presentation interesting and useful. Till we meet again next week, thank you and goodbye.